Wildfire. What do you think of when wildfire is mentioned? For many, the term evokes images of destruction, loss, and fear. While wildfire can certainly be destructive, that is only part of the story. In many ecosystems, wildfire is a fundamental ecosystem process that has a natural and unique pattern. These patterns, that include frequency, seasonality, intensity, severity, fire type, extent, and spatial pattern of fire, are collectively called the fire regime. Understanding the fire regime and how it has departed from the natural or historic norm is essential for the effective management of an ecosystem. This video is part of a series that delves into the complex world of fire regimes in the southwestern United States. By examining fire regimes, we explore the dynamic relationship between fire and the landscape, providing a deeper insight into the ecological significance of wildfire across the Southwest. In the Ponderosa pine forests of the southwestern United States, wildfire emerges as an essential element, a natural disturbance that has shaped the landscape for millennia. Diligent research has unveiled the coevolution between Ponderosa and fire, bringing to light the importance of fire to these iconic Southwest forests. This video will cover the adaptations of Ponderosa pine trees that allow them to survive fire, the historic ecological role of fire in Ponderosa pine ecosystems, how the fires of the past produced a healthy forest, the fire regime characteristics of Ponderosa pine forests, including frequency, seasonality, intensity, severity, fire type, extent, and spatial pattern of fire. The changes that have occurred in Ponderosa pine forests due to changes in the fire regime, and a look towards the future and ways that we can manage Ponderosa pine forests to provide quality habitat and important ecological functions in ways that are resilient to climate change. So let's begin. Over millennia, Ponderosa pine has adapted in various ways that have allowed these trees to survive fire. In fact, Ponderosa pine is considered one of the most fire-resistant conifers in the West, and this fire resistance increases as the tree matures. Ponderosa pine begins to develop a protective outer corky bark early in life when the saplings are about 5 centimeters in diameter, allowing some young trees to survive very low-intensity surface fires. As the tree matures, it develops thick, exfoliating bark, which sloughs off when it catches on fire and helps remove heat. The flaming bark falls away and off from the tree, reducing or preventing heat transfer and minimizing damage to the vital living cells inside the tree's cambium. Ponderosa pine also has deep roots compared to other western conifers. Although a surface fire may heat the soil and kill some of the surface roots, deeper roots remain intact and allow for the continued uptake of water and nutrients after a fire. Additionally, as they get older, Ponderosa pine naturally lose their lower branches through a process called self-pruning. This makes it harder for fast-moving surface fires to reach the crown. Self-pruning also produces the clear bole that often characterizes large, old-growth Ponderosa pine. In Ponderosa pine forests, careful observation can reveal important evidence of past wildfires. One common indicator is the presence of fire scars, also called cat faces, found on the lower trunks of trees near the ground. These scars form when a fire injures the tree's bark, exposing the living tissue underneath. However, it is important to understand that not all trees in a burned area will have visible fire scars. Ponderosa pine's thick bark generally protects the tree from fire damage. Scars are more likely to develop when additional fuel, such as fallen logs or dense brush, are positioned against the trunk, or when the bark has been compromised by animals, insects, or human activity. When you find a scarred tree, it typically indicates that the tree has survived multiple fires. Each scar is a historical record of a past fire event. Scientists study these records using dendrochronology, the science of tree ring analysis. By examining the position of a fire scar within a tree's annual growth rings, researchers can determine not only the exact year a fire occurred, but even the season when the fire burned. When data from many trees across a landscape are combined, scientists can peer hundreds to thousands of years into the past to reconstruct the historic fire regime. In addition to the specific adaptations individual ponderosa pines have evolved to survive wildfire, the structure or spatial arrangement of these forests was also shaped by frequent low-intensity fire. Historically, ponderosa pine forests were much less dense. Early Euro-American explorers often described them as park-like, open meadows filled with native grasses and wildflowers interspersed between small clusters of trees. While tree density varied based on factors such as aspect, elevation, and soil type and depth, historical averages ranged from 10 to 75 trees per acre, with an average density of about 33 trees per acre across the Southwest. In contrast, today's ponderosa pine forests are far denser, with 300 to 1,500 trees per acre. As a result, the spaces in between trees have dramatically decreased, and individual trees tend to be smaller due to intense competition for water and other resources. The open meadow-like structure of historic forests promoted low-intensity fires that crept on the ground. The fires would kill small shrubs and young trees, but would not climb into the crowns of larger trees. The number of large, intense wildfires was reduced by frequent fires that limited the accumulation of pine needles and other fuels and helped prevent young pines from encroaching into the meadows. While the vast majority of fires burned under these conditions, ponderosa pine forests in the Southwest occasionally experienced high-severity crown fire that resulted in the death of large and small trees. This recurring pattern of fire was essential for the long-term persistence and health of ponderosa pine forests in the Southwest. Now that we understand how ponderosa pines can survive and even thrive with certain types of fire, and how scientists understand what fire was like in these southwestern forests, let's dive deeper into the characteristics of a fire regime. First, what is a fire regime? A fire regime is a timeline that describes the pattern of how often an area experiences fire and what type and size of fire it typically sees. A fire regime is characterized by temporal attributes, including frequency and seasonality, the characteristics of magnitude which describe the intensity, severity, and fire type, and spatial characteristics which involve the size and spatial pattern of the fire. These components can have a profound influence on an ecosystem. This is especially true in ponderosa pine forests, where fire largely determines the structure and composition of the plant community. As the fire regime in most ponderosa forests of the Southwest has changed in the last 140 years, so has the overall health of the forest. Let's take a closer look at each component of the ponderosa pine fire regime. Fire frequency measures how often fire returns to a given area. Both the average and the range of this number are important for understanding fire dynamics in a system. Researchers have determined that up until the early 1900s, ponderosa forests experienced fire on average every 10 years, with a range from 0 to 35 years. These fires were started by lightning and by indigenous people who used fire intentionally to manage the landscape for various purposes. Southwestern fuels, including ponderosa pine, are most flammable during the dry spring before the summer monsoons. This coincides with an increase in fire activity in the spring as the weather transitions to windy, hot, and dry conditions, and there is a higher occurrence of dry lightning. Historically, peak fire season in the Southwest occurred from May to mid-July, beginning when the winter snow melted and ending when the summer monsoons brought moisture back to the region. In some years, trees may be susceptible again to fire in the fall, after the needles have dried and before the snow arrives. Winter fires can also occur during the drought years, but late-season fires depend on the presence of an ignition source. Fire intensity and severity are terms of magnitude that are often mistakenly used interchangeably, but they actually measure different variables. Intensity is a measurement of the energy produced by the fire, or how hot the fire burned. Severity is a measure of the effects of the fire on the soil and vegetation. Part of how we know that the fire regime of the past was different is that trees survived the forest fires of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and most of the 19th centuries, indicating that these trees mostly experienced low intensity and low to moderate severity surface fires. These fires left a heterogeneous spatial pattern across the landscape, consisting mostly of large, orange-barked, old-growth trees dotting open, grassy meadows. In the past, fires in the Southwest were usually small and burned in a patchy mosaic of low and moderate severity, leaving some areas unburned. These fires were highly variable and were often driven by shifts in weather patterns from year to year. Wetter years boosted the growth of grass and wildflowers, leaving more continuous surface fuels for the subsequent fire season. This cycle of large fire years following wet years occurred across the Southwest. We do not know the full spatial extent of fires. However, some 20 to 40% of the total forested area was estimated to have burned during the 20 most active regional fire years between 1700 to 1900. High severity patches occurred within the larger fires, but these patches were generally small, ranging from a few trees up to a couple hundred acres. Over the past 140 years, human activities such as grazing, logging, fire exclusion practices, and climate change have significantly reshaped ponderosa pine forests. Without regular fire, tree seedlings grew unchecked and dense fuels accumulated. Meanwhile, longer droughts, hotter temperatures, and more episodic precipitation have left trees more vulnerable to insects, disease, and high severity fire. Wildfire season has changed too. Today, fire season is no longer tethered to natural ignitions in the dry spring season. It now extends nearly year-round due to increased human ignitions and more abundant and drier fuels. The concept of a fire season has now been expanded to include all times when conditions are favorable for fires. Fire regimes in the ponderosa pine forests of the Southwest have changed primarily due to forest management. Additionally, ongoing drought and fuel accumulation will lead to more frequent and intense wildfires. These changes are a growing concern to nearby communities at the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, where the risks of wildfire impacts, like home loss and damages to watersheds, viewsheds, and recreational areas, continues to rise. To restore the health and ecosystem function of the forest and reduce risk to communities, we must use active management. Techniques such as fuel reduction treatments with prescribed fire and managed wildfire help restore a more natural fire regime for ponderosa forests, ensuring that these forests remain resilient, sustainable, and able to support both wildlife and human communities far into the future.